My job now is to introduce our next speaker, who is our keynote for this event today. General Allen is a retired U.S. Marine four-star general. He has had an incredibly decorated and varied career in uniform both for 38 years and since his retirement from the military a few years ago. Some of his last assignments were as the Deputy Commander of Central Operations Command and Commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force for Afghanistan. After his retirement, General Allen was a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security, and he was appointed the Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIL. He now has affiliations with the Brookings Institute, Johns Hopkins, and the Council on Foreign Relations. I guess to preempt, General Allen will probably speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll take question and answers afterwards. Thank you very much, and General Allen, we look forward to hearing your comments.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to be with you here today. And Larry, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me just ask briefly, and I'm sorry to put some labor on the crowd here. Could I see all the students stand up for a moment, please? If everyone in here would just take note of how many young, please sit down, how many young faces we have in this room today. And I would contend that what we speak here today and what we say here today, what we do that results from today, has got to be for them. It's not for us anymore. We've long past the point where we're going to be able to change the world. It's going to be their world to change. We've got to set them up for success, and that's why I'm so glad that we see so many of them in here this morning. At a personal level, it would be very difficult for me to overstate my sense of the importance of the many, many contributions that Senator Sam Nunn has made, Chairman Nunn has made to America, and to the peace and the stability of the world in which we have seen him provide such profound leadership that he still offers us today in this extraordinarily dangerous world and in the difficult and challenging moments that we face as America. So speaking for a generation of Americans, I can only say thank you, sir. Thank you for your service and for your sacrifice. And institutions like this one, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, continue your work for the good of our country and, frankly, for the good of the world and all humankind. And I want to reiterate the thanks that was extended this morning in the acknowledgement to Bank of America. Because not only is this a partnership that produces a forum like today, if we're ever to find our way out of the wilderness of the challenges we have right now in this world, it's going to require those kinds of partnerships in the broader community of nations to resolve the problems that we face. It's very good to see Sandy Winnefeld here as well, one of the finest military leaders in the modern era of the United States of America. And the fact that he is here, I think, speaks so well of this institution. And Sandy, it's a great pleasure to see you here. I was Commandant at the Naval Academy a number of years ago. First Marine to be Commandant. My classmates called it the Great Experiment. There's another Marine there now. Took a few years. But I remember that day when we played Georgia Tech. I had never really had much experience with the Ramblin' Wreck of Georgia Tech, or the wrecks themselves. And the game started, as it always does at Annapolis, with much hope, and then it sort of goes downhill from there. At least during those days, before, frankly, Paul Johnson showed up and he turned around Navy football, and I think he's had a small influence here as well. And then it started with the flyover F-18s, those magnificent carrier aircraft that has defined the power of the United States Navy from our carrier force. And then I think, as I recall, my memory's a bit dim. I've been trying to get this out of my mind, actually. We went into halftime at about, I think, 50-0. And I was looking to get those carrier strike aircraft back again, because the only way we were going to win this game was something happening terribly on the other side of the field. Now, Georgia Tech did let down its guard for a moment, and we scored 7 points. But it was my first experience with the Ramblin' Wrecks at Georgia Tech, and I want that to be the last one, frankly. So answering the question, how does all this end, and what can we do about it? Sadly, in the short term, there is no answer to this question. How does ISIL end? Not on the course we're on. But I do believe there is a way out of this wilderness. The wilderness of radicalization and extremism and violence and human misery. But it will require more of us as a people in the future than we are willing to devote today. But I also believe that we're out of options on this path that we tread, reacting to one crisis after another. Now, having fought in Iraq against al-Qaeda and in Afghanistan against the Taliban, and having helped the president to lead the formation of a coalition to fight yet another group, the so-called Islamic State, my thinking has been crystallizing around the realities that we're facing today and the challenges that we must confront in the future as they relate to this and other groups. Indeed, as a people, and as a country, and as a member of the community of nations, the United States is behind the power curve in understanding and defining the challenges we face, and in organizing in ways that can get us ahead of the spreading extremism whose most recent face is that of ISIL, or what our Arab friends and partners call Daesh. If we are ever to change our current situation, one which I fear consigns us to the reality of interminable piecemeal conflicts and war, we must seize the future and shape it, or it will shape us. The great challenge we face as we move forward against the Islamic State, Daesh, is in ensuring that our efforts and our energies and our solutions are adequate to the task, not just today, but tomorrow. So how does this end? It doesn't end on the course we're on, because ISIL is a symptom of something much bigger, something much darker, something the solution of which will require decades, maybe even a generation to address. And even then, it's not clear there is an end to ISIS or its idea in a linear sense, as much as there's a fundamental change in the strategic environment that undercuts the logic of an ISIL and the unrelenting jihadism that has emerged with it. I would propose that we should face this challenge at three horizons: the near, distant, and deep horizons. Now, while there's nothing exact or precise about these divisions, they're a useful intellectual framework for organizing our thinking. In close, at the near horizon, we have to fight. Organizations like Daesh and al-Qaeda and Jemaah Islamiyah, Abu Sayyaf and others, they're on the march, and they're in the attack. And as we face these groups over time, they're becoming more sophisticated and more capable. ISIS is more capable than al-Qaeda because it's adapted contemporary technology to link relatively disparate and far-flung extremist and increasingly criminal networks in ways that al-Qaeda couldn't or wouldn't. And the next group, the son of ISIS, will be even more sophisticated, and we must assume that. And so this threat is more pervasive, more connected, more networked, and more lethal. And we must defend ourselves from moment to moment at the near horizon. And those who cannot resist, and where we can, we need to rescue those living under this horror. To that extent, and sadly from long experience, we've learned these groups must operate in three broad spheres, which are commingled and which must be engaged simultaneously: the physical sphere, the financial sphere, and the information or cyber spheres. And it is to that extent, in these three spheres, that we are engaged in defeating Daesh today. In the physical sphere, our efforts are paying off in Iraq and in Syria, but the process is slow because we've chosen to work primarily through indigenous forces. And this is complicated by political realities at the local, regional, and international levels. And I could digress here and spend the remainder of this presentation just talking about Syria, Russia, Turkey, the United States, and the civil war in that country. Political realities as complex as I have ever seen them. In the financial sphere, where Daesh initially made substantial gains in self-sufficiency, we're shrinking its financial space and reducing its options and thus its capacity for sustainability. And concurrent with the other activities in our actions against those spheres, we're also contesting Daesh's efforts in the information space. And here, ladies and gentlemen, here may be the decisive battle space. For Daesh rides on a set of ideas that capitalize on and feed the factors that radicalize vulnerable and key elements of vast populations, reached through the skillful leveraging of modern information technologies in ways we've never seen before. So defeating Daesh in the physical space will never end this struggle. To defeat this group and what will be an unceasing succession of groups, we must kill the idea of Daesh as a solution. And centrally, we must address the conditions that give birth to these abominations. Doing this moves us towards the answer to the question, how does this end? But as a question, it's unanswerable. Perhaps the relevant question is, where must we go to see the future? Interminable conflict cannot be the solution in dealing with Daesh and other mutations of this extremism. We must also embrace a deep vision of the future. As the senator said, this will require the capacity to envisage strategic ends that we must achieve, ends which will require, indeed will demand, fundamental reforms in many countries. Reforms to address the massive inequities within so many communities that leave vast segments of the world's population without inclusion, without justice, without civil and human rights, and without economic prospects for the future. In essence, without hope. These communities are increasingly characterized by an emerging youth bulge. Some call it a youth surge, a demographic global megatrend across much of the Muslim tier, from Morocco to Mindanao. These youth, frustrated at their lot and angry at their limited opportunities, and are radicalized under these circumstances, and they become fertile ground for the extremist recruiters of Daesh and Al-Qaeda and others. In that distant future, beyond the horizon of what we have to do today to defend ourselves, perhaps 15 years from now, we will need to take collective action to strengthen and to build resilience in key fragile states under assault today. These measures will be strong in security and defense and the intelligence sectors, but must also emphasize judicial and economic reform. To deliver both the promise of justice and the prospect of economic development. And above all these reforms, we must address the pernicious and the corrosive effects of corruption, which is one of the greatest brakes on governmental capacity and development, and one of the greatest impediments to democracy. Looking further into the future, at the deep horizon, perhaps a generation or more from now, beyond my life, but not beyond the lives of those precious young faces you saw just a moment ago. We have to envision a comprehensive plan of reforms that can address and undercut so many of the underlying factors that have radicalized and polarized so many. And these aren't unique or isolated to one part of the world or even unrelated, because we find them in so many places, say in Sumatra or in Bangladesh or in Karachi or in the Gulf or across North Africa. The reasons for weak and or corrupt governance and the forces that combine to create fragile or failing states are nearly always the same. We must face this reality and embrace the enormity of what this will take. For this will demand a comprehensive grand strategy as we seek results at the deep horizon. Now, embracing this comprehensive strategy to achieve effects at the deep horizon will require that we think differently, will require that we think anew about how we're organized within our own government, think expansively about forming and wielding international coalitions, and think comprehensively not just about how we formulate strategies, but importantly, how we implement them as well. It would be difficult to overstate how big and how significant this undertaking will be. There are some who say that this cannot ever occur, that we can never mobilize the kind of collective approach and the resources that can fundamentally change the trajectory that we face. And they could be right, but I hope to God they're not. Because in truth, the trajectory we're on is not promising. Apart from the issues of expanding radicalization and increasingly virulent extremist groups, the implications of the global megatrends alone that are every day shaping our future demand our attention now as well. In many ways, these global trends are not only at work sculpting inexorably the geostrategic landscape, they are also the forces which, if left unaddressed, will likely both expand and accelerate the conditions that feed the security challenges of the future. In fact, I would propose they are inextricably linked. Our success will ultimately require that we account for the one while we actively treat the other. And while I'll discuss these trends briefly over the next few minutes, they are normally considered to be five. The migration of wealth from east to west on the globe, major demographic change, rapid, uncontrolled, unplanned urbanization, the emergence of technology, and climate change and resource scarcity. Some scholars have more, some scholars have fewer, but I typically talk about five. For example, wealth is moving away from the regions most in need of help. And the demography out to 2050 does not favor the developed or the developing world, whose populations will age, stagnate in numbers, or shrink, while those of the developing world will grow. And that segment of the population growing the fastest is that between roughly 15 and 25 or 29 years of age, depending on who's counting, whose expectations for good governance, individual justice, inclusivity of women, basic human rights and economic opportunities will be increasingly frustrated. To illustrate the magnitude of this challenge, each year, approximately 121 million adolescents around the world turn 16 years of age. 121 adolescents around the world turn 16 years of age. 89% of them are turning 16 in the developing regions of our world. In employment alone, their economic prospects, most of those who want work will be unable to find it. To that extent, the so-called Arab Spring was, and I strongly believe, a harbinger of our future. I think it's useful at this point to take a moment to review what the Arab Spring was and what it was not. First, what it was not. It was not a widespread religious upheaval to threaten the world with Islam out of control. I was at the Central Command at the time as the deputy. And as we watched the conflagration unfold across the region, burning its way across North Africa towards us in the Middle East, we found through our intelligence resources that Al-Qaeda was caught as flat-footed as everyone else by the spontaneity of this upheaval. While there's nothing amusing about any aspect of this crisis, we did find it supremely ironic that Al-Qaeda was attempting to sprint out ahead of the unfolding instability to take credit for these widespread uprisings. Few were foiled by this ploy, and few were convinced that al-Qaeda was at the center of the causal factors. Now, I'm not implying there was no dimension of religion in this crisis, but Islam and being a Muslim were not fundamental to this phenomenon. What the Arab Spring was and what it remains, for it's still going on, was the result of the confluence of myriad, festering, unresolved, or simply insoluble generational factors. Incompetent and non-inclusive governance, an absence of justice, rampant predatory corruption, massive inequality, burgeoning and frustrated youthful populations, lack of educational opportunities, and few economic prospects. In one form or another, each one of those factors was at work on that day in December 2010, when this young Tunisian husband and father, Mohamed Bouazizi, dispossessed of his livelihood by corrupt local officials, and utterly frustrated and despondent with his life under a pervasive tyranny, poured petrol on himself and let himself aflame, an act that would figuratively and literally set the region ablaze. Thus began the terrible summer of 2011, occurring at roughly the 100-year point in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the region for centuries. Long described as the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire held the region together for centuries through a loose system of regional and sub-regional patrimony, and through the ruthless local suppression of indigenous tribes. The Allied imposition of post-World War I administration of the Ottoman wilayats, their provinces, or the so-called mandatory period did little to replace the Ottoman rule with something better. Indeed, one imperial rule was largely exchanged for another, except that the new rulers, the Europeans, had little real experience in the region and even less capacity to understand and to shape the social dynamics than had the Turks. Thus, most of post-World War I states of the greater Middle East were born inside boundaries they would never have drawn for themselves. They were led by leaders they would never have chosen for themselves, and were governed by weak institutions that, for the most part, neither governed well nor humanely. And the elites of the region, they lived at great material distance from their populations, which would eventually be called, euphemistically and sadly, the Arab Street, and from which so much turmoil would emerge. So as the West emerged from the war to end all wars, the resulting mandatory period would plant the seeds in the Middle East, which in the second decade of the 21st century would render us all a cruel harvest. As the conflagration of 2011 engulfed the region, one dictator after another went down, while by and large the monarchies held together. The dictatorships folded largely because of the inherent fragility of their systems, preventing, as they had, normal evolutionary social venting that accompanies social progress and the effects of modernity, and the development of political and institutional maturity and viable political opposition parties. In essence, they possess little resilience and shock absorbency. The monarchies, on the other hand, had their own problems with governmental institutions, but had not lost their deep and stabilizing reach into the tribal societies of the region. That reach, and having the resources to quiet dissent, left them in a better state than the dictatorships. But every country in the region was destabilized in some form or another by the events of 2011. And from the Arab Spring, the emergence of the civil wars across the region only magnified the human misery and accelerated the flight of millions, the largest refugee displacement since the Second World War. Libya and Syria as conflicts are now seemingly irreconcilable. Yemen is both a failed state and also a civil war, stoked by the Saudi-Iranian Cold War itself. And Iraq, though not technically a civil war or a failed state, was perilously close to going over the edge in the onslaught of ISIL in 2013 and 14, which drew its own organizing principles and comparative strength from the sanctuary of the Syrian civil war. So the tinder of the fire of 2011, the Arab Spring, was to be found in widespread social and economic frustration by youthful populations, centered in teeming cities, the effects of which were communicated near simultaneously over the internet through social media. And so we see the convergence and the intersection of the mega trends that we face and the causal factors of radicalization. So let me return briefly to the mega trends. Urbanization will be one of the greatest challenges we will face, and is increasing rapidly in both scope and velocity. By 2050, nearly 3/4 of the world's population will live in the megacities. Already 20% of the world's population lives in one of the 27 of the world's megacities. These teeming cities will be harder and harder to govern and to sustain as infrastructure is stretched to the breaking point, and masses of the poor will shelter in what are becoming known even today as mega slums. They've become no-go areas, essentially existing beyond the writ of national, regional, and municipal governments, and are locally governed by criminal or extremist non-state actors. And to that end, please be careful of that term, ungoverned space. It's a term that we in the West throw around very lightly without understanding its meaning. Unless there are no humans in a piece of ground, it's a governed space. For sure, there's governance. It's going on in these mega slums, but it's usually completely at odds with our own Western, Westphalian sense of what governance means. And military planners are now beginning to use the term feral cities for cities that exist completely beyond the writ of the host nation involved. And it will get hotter, as this summer has been the hottest on record, and last summer was the hottest on record before that, and so on. The heat will complicate and enrage cultivation and weather patterns essential to our agriculture. And resources now already scarce, like water, will become casus belli, reasons for war. By 2050, the global population will exceed 8 billion people, and we will need 50% more energy, 40% more water, 35% more food. And finally, with the rise of technology, which carries such great promise for all of us, will also create the means to network with nearly completely secure communications the angry, disenfranchised, and radicalized masses in ways that will likely outstrip the capacity of less sophisticated or impoverished local national governments to compete. And finally, if it's even recognizable at all, the rules-based system of global intercourse, the system which brought us the stability and the prosperity out of the ashes of World War II and in the aftermath of the Cold War, will be sorely pressed to account for the realities of these trends. We're seeing this already with a resurgent Russia and an increasingly assertive and even muscular China. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have seen the enormity of a challenge like this before, and we were able to respond. But it took visionaries able to see beyond the politics of the moment, visionaries who had deep insights about the future, who could imagine communities and organizations and ways and means to achieve strategy outcomes beyond the horizon of their own lives. The senator talked about it this morning. The containment strategy of the Cold War, derived by the United States and her allies and partners, was nothing less than a generational strategy to limit the single greatest existential threat to the West, a nuclear-armed Soviet empire already enslaving tens of millions in Eastern Europe, a Soviet Union intent on the defeat of the West. And as I said a few minutes ago, we must think as broadly and we must think as differently today as we thought about containment strategy, for it was far more than simply a military strategy. Indeed, it can be argued that the greatest single accomplishment of the era One of the knockout blows of the Soviet Union wasn't its military encirclement by the West, but rather the political and economic alternative to communism presented by the Marshall Plan. If we're ever then to get to the left of radicalization, if we're ever to reduce the pell-mell spread of violent extremism, there can be no solution to the problems we've raised this morning without a comprehensive, long-term grand strategy which not only embraces interministerial or interagency approaches, but is also an international approach, one in which the private sector must be a robust participant with the coalition and communities of nations. What comes to mind immediately is something that looks much like the counter-ISIL coalition, where at its beating heart reside the Arab states and those states whose population contain large Muslim concentrations, for they must be central to the outcome. And I would also contend for this strategy to work, it must span a swath of the world's surface, which includes not only the traditional Middle East, but also the northern tier of Africa, areas of sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South Asia, and the key states of Southeast Asia, with large and majority Muslim populations. Now, formulating the grand strategy will be hard enough. And frankly, we could find, depending on political events, we could find U.S. leadership reluctant to lead the effort, either to formulate or to implement that strategy. As we gather here today, the U.S. is in the throes of a campaign for the 2016 presidential election. Regardless who wins, the new president must consider whether he or she will be the one to finally make the decision, hard though it may be, to undertake immediately the formulation of a grand strategy, not only forming a whole-of-government team of our finest strategic thinkers, but also investing and inviting our closest allies, friends, and industry partners into the process. While rationality would dictate that this should be a U.S.-led formulation, it's doomed to fail if it's not an international outcome. If we're able to fashion the generational grand strategy, the really hard part then begins, the implementation. My own experience has taught me that strategies, good or bad or indifferent, are for naught without carefully crafted implementation or follow-through. And this will be, as is often the case, what the military calls the long pole in the tent. If U.S. leadership was important to the formulation of the strategy, it will be essential to its implementation. Without exaggerating the issue, the enormous gravity of this undertaking is striking, with no contemporary analog except perhaps the formation of the United Nations and its family of agreements and organizations at the end of the Second World War, or the development of the containment strategy, or the Marshall Plan, or even the Manhattan Project. My point is this: we will never get to the left of radicalization and violent extremism without the decision by the world's leadership to commit once and for all to lift the necessary weight to solve this crisis. As hard as this may be, when one considers historically the size of the stakes of previous measures we've mentioned, I'm encouraged that this is possible. For we've had the moral and the intellectual capacity to do this before. And yes, it was enormous, and it was hard, and not without risk or without setback, and even without war. And we came perilously close to the nuclear brink. But the logic was sufficiently sound, and the vision was sufficiently clear, that it survived as an idea from one administration to another, as a strategy to carry us through the darkness of the Cold War. We are up to this. We are up to this because perpetual conflict cannot be the birthright we bequeath our precious children. There are some who contend we no longer possess the talent to craft a strategy to this end, nor do we have the spiritual fortitude or moral intrepidity to carry it out. I profoundly disagree, which brings me to George Marshall. He and others like George F. Kennan, also in the ilk of the great thinkers of that era, were able to fashion a way out of the wilderness that would become the Cold War. For contributions of that nature, George Marshall would eventually be recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. We had both the prototype thinker and the prototype plan. And in 1947, in describing the Marshall Plan, Before an audience of Harvard, George Marshall would offer the kind of view to shape our thinking today. And we should take heart in the words that he speaks, for he has blazed a trail for us to follow. Our policy is directed against no nation or doctrine, he would say, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be a revival of a working economy in the world, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Such assistance, I'm convinced, must not be on a piecemeal basis as various crises develop. Any assistance that this government may render in the future should provide a cure rather than a mere palliative. Any government that is willing to assist in the task of recovery will find full cooperation, I assure you, on the part of the U.S. government. And any government that maneuvers to block the recovery of other countries cannot expect help from us. Furthermore, governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery in order to profit therefrom, politically or otherwise, will encounter the opposition of the United States. Now, I believe we can envision, he would finish, end of quote, I believe we can envision, and we can fashion, and we can implement the kind of long-term grand strategy necessary to address this crisis. Indeed, as I said at the beginning, from my perch and my experience, I would contend that not doing so leaves us with no options in the future. In 1862, as the horizon was darkening for an America sinking into the abyss of the Civil War, President Lincoln admonished Americans to rise to the crisis that they faced. And he would say, quote, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so must we think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we can save our country." Unquote. And so, we must think anew, and we must act anew, and we must seize the future to save our country, if not all of humankind. And if not for us, then for our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And so how does this end? There is no end in the Napoleonic sense of our old notions of victory and defeat. The solution to ISIL and its inevitable spawn is reform and change. And it will take a generation, and it will start somewhere. But let it start now, and let it start with us. Thank you very much.
I'm going to share the mic for a second with General Allen. Thank you very much, General Allen. I'm going to be here facilitating the question and answer part of this. We have about 25 minutes. I hope you can all hear me now. There's a couple of different options. One, basically to raise your hand and you'll be recognized, and there will be student volunteers on one side and on the other. And there's another way also. You can send in your questions. If you go onto the website of the registration and the Nunn live feed, you can send your questions in that way, and they will come to me here. But a couple things about the questions. We'd really like you to identify yourselves and potentially where you're from, and in terms of your institution or wherever. And also make sure that you guys have a question and not necessarily a commentary or a statement. You can use that for the break. We'd like to try to get as many questions as possible and respect everybody's time. Thank you very much. Question? Should I just shout it out? I think we're going to come around with a microphone so we can hear it. Oh, here we go. We can. Oh, here we go. Oh, we want to get it for recording purposes, so we have.
Hi, I'm Mark Sachs. I would say that I'm just a knowledgeable amateur and concerned citizen. So my question is, I do have to frame it with one remark that I find quite astonishing, actually, in what I would say this august body. After reading the description of today's forum, and after hearing you speak, I've heard every reason for why radicalization or an extremist ideology exists. except for the actual naming of an ideology. An ideology is something that doesn't come necessarily from poverty, doesn't come from having a destruction of a community. There is an ideology. In fact, Isbit Tahrir says their, quote, ideology is Islam, as does Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf in Philippines, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, or IS, which was not named as Islamic State. In fact, I counted no fewer than 10 euphemisms in the description. So my question is, if this incredible body of academics and intellectuals and professionals are afraid in an intellectual way to discuss the foundational ideology of the problem, how are we to expect anybody in the West to have an honest conversation about how to, in fact, address the problem, which is an ideology that we refuse to name?
Well, what do you think it is?
I believe Islam is, in effect, having a war with itself. There are people like Zuhdi Jasser, there are people like Ayan Hirsi Ali who speak out, or Majid Nawaz, who's a former radical, who names it.
Yeah, well, we need to name it. Let me make the point. The issue isn't Islam. So I'm very careful about that. The issue is not Islam. Let's make sure we're clear about that issue.
Well, hold on. Well,
it is individuals who cherry pick from the faith of Islam for their own purposes.
That is an entirely fair assertion. However, people like, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Sure.
They are calling it Islamic State. Now, we can discuss where in Islam they are selecting it from. We can have a discussion, as again, many reform Muslims are engaged in this discussion publicly and internationally to say it is a portion of Islam that needs to be addressed. But if we don't have an honest conversation, we are cutting at the knees those moderate and reform Muslims who care to be taken seriously, that these are significant issues. We are telling them, you know what? You're wrong. You don't know your own religion. We in the West are going to tell you what's Islamic. We are going to tell you who's Muslim. So if someone like Zuhdi Jasser, who is well known for working on reforming Islam, if he comes out and speaks, but we in the West say, you don't really know what you're talking about your own religion, what does that do for any moderate and reform Muslim out there who cares to take a stand for their religion? We are not in the West giving people the information to make a discerned difference. We're not giving them the language because we don't discuss it.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with you.
On what?
I agree that the discussion needs to be held, but I don't believe at all that those who are informed in the West are taking the capacity for Muslims to be part of the solution. In fact, we believe absolutely that I have far little credibility in the world at large to be able to speak knowledgeably about Islam. King Abdullah in Jordan, for example, said, the solution to this is an Arab face and a Muslim voice. And the Malaysians have begun a messaging center because they believe there must be a Southeast Asian face and a Muslim voice. Mm-hmm. And there's a very good chance that we'll see a messaging center emerge in Nigeria because there should be an African face and a Muslim voice. The point is, the solution to this is a Muslim voice to counter those individuals who seek to use Islam as the means for the justification of a series of horrific acts, which in fact are completely at odds with the faith of Islam, the faith of peace, which is what Islam means. So I'm not sure I follow what you're saying.
Well, look, we are going to get into a certain discussion with Islam means submission. That is what it means. So now you can argue and you can go through all the hadith, you can go through the sunnahs, you can actually be specific, and there are many of them. This is not a liturgical discussion. That's not the point. The question is, we in the West are not Muslim. Well, I would say probably you are. I am not a Muslim expert, Islamic expert. However, there are, when the sheiks who are guiding these ideologies are themselves relying on liturgical quotes, when they are relying on the history of Islam to, in effect, continue the ideology, we have to acknowledge it's coming from an ideology. There are Islamists. That's different than Muslims. We don't have the discussion of naming the variations or what it means. I'm just suggesting that I find it interesting that we have not had this discussion in here, when in fact it is the core of the ideology. Thank you.
I think it's a very important point.
So that was it.
But one of the most important aspects of this is knowledgeable Muslims who can counter that message. For example, the suicide bombers that we saw in Afghanistan came from the Taliban sect. but one of the greatest interpretations of both the Quran, the Holy Quran, and the Hadith came from another Muslim scholar, Abdul Sayyaf, who wrote a great treatise on this, dozens of pages, selecting verses from the various surah of the Quran and the Hadith, and making the case that while on the one hand, people who called themselves Muslim were completely justified in attacking the apostates and using suicide tactics to do it, on the other hand, it was the most horrific and abominable approach to Islam, and it should be discarded and dissuaded from anyone who would call themselves a Muslim. We have to empower them. That's the point that I've been trying to make. And there are plenty in the West who would simply say it's about Islam and it's about Muslims. It is not. It's about those who would selectively interpret that faith for their own purposes and attack you and me, but more importantly, they've killed far more Muslims by that interpretation. Therefore, we should empower. We should empower them to defeat themselves, to defeat those interpretations. That's the point. And I think in the West, we have plenty of responsible scholars who recognize that and seek to support our Muslim partners in this process.
Thanks. I'm going to take some more questions. We'll actually address some of these issues probably in the next panels. I saw one in the corner over there. Some of the students, the woman.
How about that, lady?
Yeah, that's.
I got a
I
mic
can't
here.
identify the comment. I think the
I
microphone.
have a mic here.
Oh, let me get. She's been waiting for a little while. Sorry, sir. Oh,
I'll be quick.
Right.
Go ahead, sir.
General Lance Corporal De Pasquale here.
Semper Fi.
My question is, how do you feel about redefining the problem as being a fight against accumulated resentments stemming from big oil?
I'm sorry, from what?
From big oil. From big oil coming into the Middle East 100 years ago, and the accumulated resentments that have emerged from that.
Well, I think it's an important question. You know, as I tried to convey from the very earliest moments that the West came in big to that region, our presence was fraught. There were economic reasons for it. There were governmental reasons for it. In some places, it worked quite well. In other places, it didn't. I would not attribute the anger that is felt necessarily for the West solely to big oil, but it is certainly the economic issues that have created often such widespread anger in the region to the leaders that have permitted extraction to occur and to the West, which has conducted the extraction. Oil is a part of it, but it's a broader economic issue. I think that's an important question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm actually going to take this opportunity to run from a question we have from those that are not here. And this actually comes from a Georgia Tech master's alumnus. Do the efforts at economic diversification, Tejas Kotak, do the efforts at economic diversification in Riyadh signal a model for change for other nations in the Middle East?
There's going to need to be widespread diversification, and I think that we have seen we're seeing it in Saudi Arabia, as the question implies, but we have already seen it in other places where they've recognized that, in essence, a single commodity economy is a strategic liability. One of the first meetings that I had with the Prime Minister in Iraq, as we went back in now to deal with Daesh, was partly about how we would help the Iraqis fight the Islamic State, but much of the conversation was dominated by how we could help the Iraqis stabilize their economy, which in the aftermath of the drop of oil prices really had them flat on their back. And so, yes, the diversification strategies that we're seeing more broadly across the Middle East, I think, are essential, and those who are pursuing it have a strategic vision, which I think is important. And where we have seen it, we've seen it across the Middle East, but where we have seen it, I think, best illustrated is in the United Arab Emirates. It is a remarkable community. It is a remarkable nation. And the vision of the sheikhs of the Emirates in going after diversity of their economy and going after diversity of education I think sets the gold standard in that region for how populations can be both governed and included at a time when it's very difficult in other places. And so that question is an important question, and I think it does signal something important for Saudi Arabia, but it's not the first in the region where we've seen that. It's been other places as well, and the Emirates set the standard for it.
I thought I had one here. If not,
there's a gentleman in the back. There's a gentleman about two-thirds way back.
oh, okay. Go ahead. Gino.
My name is Munzir Zafar. I'm a Georgia Tech student in ECE department. I come from Pakistan. I'm Muslim, and I have been studying these issues. I have very deep interest in these issues, as anybody can imagine. My question is specifically when you pointed, I agree with a lot of your analysis about the underlying reasons, the economic problems and people feeling disenfranchised, especially the youth, and them then being led to these extreme ideas by some of these people. But as far as the solution that you offered is concerned, which is basically you're pointing out to the fact that Muslim voice has to be taken on board, and Muslims should be seeing that the solution is being owned by them, as opposed to being led or force-fed to them by the United States, and that's a very important part of the solution. But when we get to the details of it, that's where I think a lot of issues, a lot of contradictions within U.S. policy emerge. Just to be specific, a lot of the that you mentioned, you said we have Muslim governments who are leading these initiatives, and I assume those governments include people like King Salman of Saudi, or General Sisi of Egypt, or Bashar al-Assad, for example, in Syria. A lot of these governments themselves are considered very illegitimate by the same Muslims who you are trying to take on board for your for taking this. So when you lead initiatives using such government or such people who are already people are rising against. For example, you mentioned Arab Spring. Arab Spring was actually a result of people rising against tyrants, and Arab Spring is a proof that Muslims do not necessarily go for violent means to change the governments, but they want change in the governments.
The violence stemmed from the peaceful efforts at the beginning. You're exactly correct.
Right. And so this is a fundamental problem for the U.S. government in that you are trying to take Muslims on board, but you are at the same time shaking hand with those governments who are not representative of these people. And they are rather serving, a lot of them are being seen by the Muslims as serving U.S. interests themselves, protecting the flow of oil, for example, or like the case of Mohammed Morsi being kicked out by Sisi and U.S. government staying silent and not even calling it a coup d'etat. That's where a lot of resentment comes from the Muslim masses. And so I see that's a fundamental challenge for the U.S.
It is.
To lead the change forward. Yeah.
Absolutely is. Thank you for that comment.
These are great questions. One thing I want to try to remind you guys to keep it as short as possible, concise as possible. Let me get one from this side right here. There we go.
Hi, my name is Anna Catherine Finch, and I'm an International Affairs Master's student here at Georgia Tech. Thank you for being here, General Allen.
Good morning.
My question is, you spoke a lot about how the implementation of a grand strategy is just as important as the formulation of that strategy. So my question is, how do we, as the United States, overcome the many barriers to cooperation with other great powers in order to implement such a strategy, particularly with Russia, as we're seeing right now?
Well, this is going to be a real challenge for us. I think Syria is the greatest example of where this isn't working. The Russians, of course, and I don't want to get into the Syria policy on this issue, but I believe that the community of nations is broad enough and the resources that can be brought to bear are substantial enough that we can begin that process, and hopefully those states that are outliers or those states that ultimately are not part of the process in the beginning will join when the time comes. I was just in New York for the beginning of the UN General Assembly, and I was a participant in some of the early work of the Clinton Global Initiative, where much of this was talked about. And if there was one criticism that I think it was a self-criticism of the governments and international organizations and NGOs and the attentive elite that were participants. The constant criticism was that there are resources that can be brought to bear. There are communities that can be helped. But the absence of a strategic, coherent plan for that process, and the absence of a coherent plan ultimately to make change and reform fundamental ultimately to the application of those resources, is what is the real limiting factor here. We're not comprehensively attempting to deal with issues either in regions or in countries in a permanent way because there's no political dimension to it and there's no coherence ultimately to the outcome. So we find that we deal with an issue, find that we deal with a tribe or a country or a region, but we don't deal with an overarching problems. And the absence of coherence in that means that there's many organizations with similar overheads and resources go to the sustainment of organizations operating separately from each other, trying to do the same thing, and even sometimes commitments of resources on the ground have a fratricidal effect, where they're competing with each other on the ground and the outcome is a competition that leaves the community less secure or less stable than they were before. So the one of the conclusions, but one conclusion which I was struck with because I was listening mostly, was this sense that absent a clear overarching plan to bring the various entities together to include the private sector, which plays a role but doesn't play a role in the comprehensive way it can, given the valuation of many private sector entities in the world today is far greater than the GDPs of many countries in the world. Bringing them into the plan for a comprehensive application and implementation process is really what's necessary. Thank you.
I'm going to put together a few questions here and kind of shape it in a different way and piggyback off on another one we had. Really, the question kind of comes at how do we balance this idea of how do we balance this idea of pushing or wanting regions or governments in the region to reform, yet at the same time knowing that we have strategic interest with them, and we not undermine them at the same time by pushing this type of reform?
Well, it goes to the question that gentleman asked a moment ago, and that is we're going to have to work with those countries that are willing to work with us and able to do as much as we possibly can in there, recognizing that there will simply be limitations in the short term. But I think the logic of working with countries in the region and showing that in fundamental ways those countries can change for the benefit not only of themselves at the elite level, but also can change to the benefit of the populations within those countries. That can be a process which over time can convince those that are that are more resistant to change to want to become part of it. And often where we find change capable of taking hold is much less initially in attempting a full-on attempt to change the governmental process or an attempt to change the security structure, although the security platform is necessary, where often change comes most quickly that can then facilitate a sequence of change is in changing the economic equilibrium within these countries. And that's where the role of the private sector will be important. That is where the role of carefully targeted development money will be important, and to do it in a comprehensive way. And do it in a way that there are clear outputs that are recognizable and targetable, with the full expectation that when we make those investments with the private sector or with development communities and aid communities, that there will be an expectation of political reform as well. And part of the ticket to ride is a willingness to participate in that over time.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more from the audience and then one from here. And actually, the woman over there, that's why I keep pointing to you, right? Yes, that's you. Yeah. She was
We're all about to find out.
She was the first.
I'm Dorothy Toth Beasley, and I'm a retired judge in Georgia, and I have a recent degree in international law from Emory.
Congratulations.
But first, thank you. First, in answer to your suggestion as to your needing Arab faces with Muslim voices, we have right here at Emory Law School Abdullahi An-Naim from Sudan, who teaches Islamic law. And when I took that course, the class was full. I was amazed at how many American law students were interested in that. But he writes about exactly what you're talking about, and I commend some of his writings to you.
Thank you.
But my question is, and you emphasize that we need judicial and economic reform. Well, that's on two levels as far as judicial is concerned. On domestically, the judicial systems, what kind of an effect we have there, especially as related to our government's effect. Now, the ABA has the Rule of Law Initiative, which for many, many years has worked, starting with Eastern and Central Europe and now more globally. But how does our government get involved in that? And also on the higher international law level, we're not even members of the International Criminal Court. So these huge human rights violations around the world, especially by world leaders, is something that we're not willing to address.
One of the reasons that so many people are radicalized, country by country, is their sense of hopelessness. Please, ma'am, you can sit down. I know exactly where you are. Is their sense of hopelessness that they can ever receive justice within their own state, whatever that justice looks like. And as we all know, Islamic jurisprudence is quite well developed, and it falls in various schools, and I'll bet that course was extraordinarily interesting, because if more Americans understood it, I think they'd have a different feel than the rhetoric that is constantly being displayed in the broader public in the United States. The issue for me is not an attempt to, en masse, to change the judicial platforms of the world today. It is to change the judicial equilibrium in those countries, which I would contend in many of those countries there is a desire to change the failed judicial systems in so many of these states. But corruption, which has in fact made it very difficult for judges to issue their verdicts, and as you well know, of course, prosecutors to do their jobs, because in these countries it's a combination of the relationship between the prosecutors and the judges. It is the corruption of those officials that has in many respects created such damage both to the judiciary, but very importantly to the sense that a person can receive justice. And so we have, the United States, but others of our partners have done great work around the world in helping countries, both in terms of enhancing their judicial capacities, but in recovering a sense within the country that as a citizen they can receive justice from the judges and can be properly represented by the lawyers and the prosecutors. It's not an easy process, but it's an essential process. There's an old saying, if you want peace, deliver justice. In so many of these countries, frankly, the one area where the Taliban could compete with us, the area where Al-Qaeda could compete with us, the area where other extremist organizations can compete, is the sense that they can bring justice at the ground level to the people. And that's basically, they can't bring electricity, they can't bring water, they can't bring health care, they can't bring anything else. But they can bring what appears to be justice, which in their administration is both retribution and the appearance of stability. What we need to do is to work on the judiciaries, the people within it, and the judicial processes and the courts to give the people confidence that their own judiciaries can bring them justice so that they feel as though they're served by their systems.
We're actually out of time now. We have actually 10 to 20 great questions, but we're going to have to end the session here and take a break until 10:15. I want you to let's give a great thank you to General Allen and his remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.